to Biblical Psychology, the channel that combines psychological ideas with scripture to help you respond more effectively to the promises in the Bible with regards to mental health. So today we're going to take a look at the condition dissociation. And in our usual format, our agenda will be to have a look at what it is, what causes it, some suggestions of how it can be remedied, and then we're going to have a look at some scriptures that can be interpreted as having a dissociation experience. So to begin with, what is dissociation? Now, interestingly, dissociation is a concept which has its roots in chemistry to describe a general process in which molecules separate or split into other things such as atoms, ions, or radicals. So I'm just going to put a diagram on the screen just to illustrate a chemical reaction of dissociation in chemistry. And it's said to be an irreversible reaction. Now, this process might not be far off from assisting us to understand the condition of dissociation in individuals. So, within the field of psychology, dissociation covers a range of sensations of feeling disconnected from oneself, others, or the world. And this may include the feeling of being outside of your body, separated from your personality and your functions, and forgetting who you are. And just going to take you through some descriptions that people have given when experiencing these sensations. So the first is their actions feel quite robotic. It's as if they're on autopilot and spectators of their actions, like watching a TV program. Their voice may feel unfamiliar, and their thoughts, speech and actions no longer feel spontaneous. They suffer an intense focus on these feelings because, as you can imagine, it's quite frightening, and the person might feel that something awful is wrong with them, and so it makes it difficult for them to think and do their usual activities because they're so overwhelmed by their experience. Some people report that they have an inability to feel emotion, even towards people who's very close to them relationally. So they might have a knowledge of how they should feel in a particular situation. So they might say, well, I should feel happy because it's my birthday, or happy because I've got a lot of money in the bank. And they should also know when they feel sad about something. But so, for example, they may have lost someone in bereavement and they don't feel sad. And often people say they don't feel anything. So feeling quite disconnected from a natural emotional response. Some people might have bodily changes and they actually say that they feel lifeless or dead. And along with all of those feelings that I've just described, the person just feels totally cut off from the world. So I'm just going to bring up a formulation diagram just to assist you to understand the vicious cycle that's often formed when someone suffers with this condition. So they might have sensations where they feel cut off, spaced out, visual disturbance, and feeling quite numb. And this is likely then to make them vulnerable to have increased worry or apprehension, asking questions, well, what is happening to me? And often a person interprets these sensations quite negatively and might tell themselves, oh my gosh, I'm going mad. These are early signs of schizophrenia. I have a brain tumor. There's something terribly wrong with me. And you can imagine that this leads the person to be completely locked in to this cycle, and the cycle just goes on. So what might cause dissociation? And there's been a number of models put forward and ideas, so including having its roots in neurological processes. So for example, it's been linked to epilepsy in respect to seizures that people might experience with this condition, which then can cause them to experience a loss of consciousness, and also having feelings of feeling quite disconnected from themselves. It's also been found that some people who suffer a complex grief reaction following a bereavement, that they feel quite disconnected as well. And just of note, if such situations trigger dissociation in an individual, it's it often lasts for about sort of a couple of months or so, and quite sort of transient. However, I believe that the area that has overwhelming evidence for dissociation is psychological trauma. And I would say that this is the cause of the problem that most psychologists will actually seek to address. So you might ask yourself the question, well, how can psychological trauma make a person vulnerable to experiences of dissociation? Well, it's been formulated that, for example, if a child has suffered childhood trauma, and often children can't physically escape from a situation that they find frightening or abusive. And it's suggested that under such circumstances, some children learn to cope by escaping into their minds, if you like, and mentally detach themselves from the situation. And for some people, this detachment can be automatic. And for some others, it could be something that they learn over time. So, for example, I've come across someone who, experienced this condition, who was exposed to repeated domestic violence in the home. And this was something that occurred in their childhood, and when they became an adult, they experienced symptoms of dissociation. And this was particularly triggered by situations where they saw very abusive and angry images. So they might have seen it on the television, they might have witnessed somebody having a fight or an argument. And these sorts of situations will trigger their dissociative state, and that they become quite disconnected. And someone like that might experience some relief whenever they manage to avoid angry and volatile images. But as soon as they're exposed to such images, it could leave them vulnerable to developing such symptoms. So, how can this condition be treated? Well, if trauma, and often it is the case that trauma is linked to dissociation, what the individual needs is trauma-focused therapy. And this is something that they could access perhaps from their general practitioner, or they can obtain it privately. But we all know in the real world, it can be difficult sometimes to access appropriate treatment quick enough to find some relief. And a technique called grounding technique is quite a good technique to use during periods of dissociation. And so if you're someone watching this and you do experience dissociation, and you can relate to a traumatic history, you might want to try this technique. And what this means is that you just simply acknowledge how you're feeling, and tell yourself that this is not happening now. I might have experienced some trauma historically, but I'm actually okay. And you just might want to take a deep breath and focus on the here and now. You might want to focus on a positive image in your immediate environment, just to help to ground and focus yourself in the here and now whilst you're experiencing those distressing symptoms. And reassure yourself that you're not undergoing a trauma, that it's just that your brain has been triggered, and you're going to seek to calm yourself down, and you're likely to experience that these symptoms will pass eventually. So I'm just going to take you through some scriptures now, and the scriptures that I've selected, I believe, one might argue that they refer to some kind of change. I won't say disconnected, but I would say some kind of change in a process of a change in personality, if you like, or a change in mindset from what I might call a natural worldview to a biblical worldview. So the first scripture is taken from John 14 verse 6, which states, Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So that's a very profound statement that Jesus has said there. But what Jesus is actually saying is that he is the only pathway to the true and living God. Now this would be a very contentious statement to lots of people who might have different faiths and so on, but those who adopt a biblical worldview would accept these words of Jesus, and by accepting those words of Jesus, it does lead to an actual and real process of change. So when we read John 4 verse 24, it states, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. So again, that links to a process of change, and it's like living in two worlds. So we have the natural world, which is the world we see around us, and there is the unseen spiritual world. And what that verse is emphasizing is that when we worship God, we use spiritual methods to do so. So when we look at Ephesians 4, 22 to 24, it states that you put off concerning your former conduct the old man that grows corrupt according to the deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new man which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness. So what that verse is talking about is a change in our personalities from perhaps a sinful personality to a righteous and holy one. And the Bible does talk about people who adopt a biblical worldview as being partakers of what is the divine nature, so that the divinity comes from God, and Jesus was our example of what that looked like. And those of us undergoing a renewal of our minds become more and more like Jesus. And it quite literally is a process of change, and the individual recognizes the changes that takes place in their lives as a result of this process. So when we look at Galatians 2 verse 20, it states, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So that there's quite a lot to unpack in that verse, and we don't have time enough to look into the detail of it. But if I could summarize it, I would say that it just highlights there that the natural person that we were before we met Christ has been crucified, and just like Christ was crucified on the cross. But it's talking about it at a spiritual level, and we no longer live in the way that we used to, but Christ, the character of Christ, the righteous character of Christ filled with love, lives in us. And the life that we live in the flesh is that we live by faith in the Son of God, who loved us and gave himself for us. And when we look at Romans 12 verse 2, it states, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So again, that verse is just confirming that we are going through a process of change, which is called transformation, and we're being renewed. So we're beginning to see things and perceive things from the perspective of God, and by doing so, we will understand the mind of God and what his perfect will is for us. So that's all I would like to say today on dissociation, and I hope there may have been some nuggets of information that you've been able to pick up to help you along your journey of recovery. So next week we're going to take a look at personality disorder. Now don't forget to subscribe, because that way you'll be notified of all the episodes coming up. Bye bye.